The golden rays of the late afternoon sun bathed the streets of a small but resilient neighborhood. Richard Blake stood behind the counter of Blake's Mart. His convenience store nestled at the corner of 5th and Maple. The store was modest but meticulously organized. Rows of neatly stacked shelves held everything from canned goods to cleaning supplies. And the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Outside, the neighborhood bustled with its usual rhythm. A mother corralled her giggling toddlers as they dashed toward the ice cream truck parked across the street. A group of teenagers biked past, their laughter mixing with the faint hum of passing cars. An older man shuffled along the sidewalk, leaning heavily on his cane but still smiling as he waved to Richard through the storefront window. Blake's Mart wasn't just a store, it was a sanctuary for the community. It provided more than essentials, it offered a sense of belonging. Richard had taken pride in building that environment. His customers trusted him, confiding in him about their daily struggles, their triumphs, and their hopes for the future. Behind the counter, Richard adjusted the screen of the security monitor, scanning the feed. Years of serving in the military had left him with a hyper-awareness of his surroundings. A habit he couldn't shake even now. The crisp image of each aisle flickered on the screen, showing customers going about their shopping, entirely unaware of the man's past life. Richard's transition from soldier to storekeeper had been deliberate. After years of deployments in war zones, he craved the steady routine and the peace this life offered. But that peace was beginning to fray. Lately, murmurs had swept through the neighborhood, stories of business owners being threatened, their shops vandalized. Some had quietly sold their properties, leaving behind empty storefronts that were quickly scooped up by faceless developers. It wasn't hard to notice the changes creeping into the neighborhood. Rent prices were climbing, and longtime residents whispered of looming gentrification. Richard had heard the rumors but hadn't experienced anything firsthand. Yet, as he locked eyes with a customer leaving the store, a man who hesitated before offering a faint smile, he couldn't shake the sense that trouble was inching closer. As the evening crowd thinned, Richard locked the front door for a brief moment to count the cash in the register. The soft clicks of the bills stacking in his hands were oddly comforting. Everything about his store was orderly, secure, a reflection of the discipline he carried from his military days. But that order felt fragile now. When he flipped the sign back to open, he glanced down the street. For a moment, the neighborhood appeared still, but Richard's instincts warned him otherwise. The bell above the door chimed just as Richard was wiping down the counter. He glanced up to see 3 men walking into the store, their presence immediately altering the room's energy. Leading the pack was Lucas Grant, his sharp eyes scanning the shelves with an air of disdain. He was tall, lean, and moved with the confidence of someone who thought the world owed him something. Behind him was Ray Carter, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, the kind of man whose footsteps made the floor creak. Trailing at the rear was Evan Drake, lanky and twitchy, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Nice place you've got here," Lucas said as he approached the counter, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked between the 3 men, cataloging their movements. Lucas's hands rested casually on the counter, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. Ray wandered down an aisle, his boots scuffing against the tiled floor, while Evan lingered near the door, shifting nervously. "What do you need?" Richard asked evenly, setting the cloth down and folding his arms. Lucas smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we're just admiring your setup. Looks like you do good business." "We get by," Richard replied, his tone neutral. Ray picked up a can of beans, turning it over in his hands like he was inspecting it for a hidden treasure. "Bet you could do better, though," he said, his voice carrying over the shelves. "With the right partners." Lucas leaned closer, his smirk widening. "That's why we're here, to offer you a deal. You pay us a little something, say, a small percentage of your profits, and we make sure your store stays safe." Richard didn't flinch, though his grip on the counter tightened imperceptibly. "Safe from what?" Lucas laughed, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet store. "From things that happen to places that don't have our protection. Broken windows, shelves toppled over, that kind of thing." Ray let the can drop with a loud clatter, and Richard's jaw tightened. "We don't need protection," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. Lucas's grin faltered slightly before he masked it with another laugh. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't keep the lights on. You think about it. He straightened and motioned to Ray, who walked back toward the counter. Before leaving, Ray grabbed a jar of marinara sauce and hurled it onto the floor. It shattered on impact, red sauce splattering across the tiles. See you soon, old man, Lucas said, his smirk returning as the three of them walked out. As the door jingled shut behind them, Richard stared at the mess they'd left behind. He leaned down to pick up the larger shards of glass, his movements slow and deliberate. The storm had arrived, but Richard wasn't the kind of man to back down. The store was quiet after the confrontation, save for the occasional scrape of a broom as Richard swept up the shattered glass. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, but his mind raced. The calm life he had built here was under attack, and the three men who had walked in earlier weren't just petty criminals. They were part of something bigger, more calculated. After cleaning up the mess, Richard locked the door and turned off the lights. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs faded, leaving the store in darkness. He retreated to the back office, a small space crowded with file cabinets, a desk, and a safe bolted to the floor. From the safe, he pulled out a sturdy metal box and set it on the desk. Inside were items he hadn't touched in years: a tactical flashlight, a collapsible baton, and a military-grade GPS tracker. Tools he'd hoped never to use again. He wasn't just a storekeeper, he was a retired Special Forces operative. And though he had left that life behind, his instincts were sharper than ever. Richard powered up his laptop and accessed the feed from the store's security cameras. He watched the footage of Lucas, Ray, and Evan entering the store, rewinding and studying their movements. The three men were confident, almost too confident. They didn't bother hiding their faces, which meant they didn't fear being recognized. They think they're untouchable, Richard muttered to himself. After making a copy of the footage, he jotted down notes in a worn leather notebook. Their descriptions, mannerisms, and the details of their threats were all carefully recorded. He'd dealt with men like them before, bullies who preyed on perceived weakness. But Richard wasn't weak, and he wasn't about to let them run him out of his community. The next morning, Richard arrived at the store early. The air was crisp, and the street was just waking up. A few neighbors waved to him as they passed, their greetings warm but tinged with concern. Word traveled fast in their tight-knit neighborhood, and some had already heard about the trouble at Blake's Mart. Inside, Richard moved with purpose. He reinforced the locks on the doors, tested the alarm system, and repositioned the security cameras to eliminate blind spots. By the time he finished, the store felt more like a fortress than a convenience store. As the day went on, regular customers came and went, each interaction a reminder of why Richard was fighting to protect this place. A young mother came in with her toddler, picking up snacks and baby formula. An older couple stopped by for their usual loaf of bread and carton of milk. These were the people who relied on Blake's Mart, who would be left vulnerable if the store fell into the wrong hands. Around midday, Richard received a visit from a familiar face, Detective Sarah Monroe, a no-nonsense officer who had grown up in the neighborhood. She leaned against the counter, her sharp eyes scanning the store. "I heard you had some visitors," Sarah said, her tone laced with concern. Richard nodded, handing her the copy of the security footage. "3 of them came in last night, tried to strong-arm me into paying them for protection. When I refused, they started breaking things." Sarah frowned as she watched the footage on her tablet. "Lucas Grant and his crew. They've been causing trouble all over town. Intimidating business owners, vandalizing property. Most people cave and pay up. But I'm guessing you didn't." "I didn't," Richard said firmly. "And I won't." Sarah sighed, tucking her tablet under her arm. "They won't take no for an answer. Men like Lucas don't stop until they get what they want. If you push back, they'll escalate." "I know," Richard replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But I'm not backing down. This is my store, my community. They don't get to take that away." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "If you need backup, call me. I'll keep an eye on things." "Thanks, Sarah," Richard said. "I'll handle it." It wasn't long before Lucas and his crew made good on their threats. Late one evening, as the last customer left the store, Richard noticed the blue pickup truck parked across the street. The same truck from the previous night. His muscles tensed, but he didn't show it. Instead, He locked the door and continued with his closing routine, pretending not to notice. The bell above the door chimed as Lucas, Ray, and Evan entered the store once again. This time, their demeanor was even more hostile. Lucas swaggered toward the counter, his grin sharper than before. "Miss us?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. Richard didn't flinch. "I told you before, I'm not paying." Lucas's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold sneer. "And I told you before. That's not how this works." Ray stepped forward, knocking over a display rack with a loud crash. Chips and candy bars spilled across the floor, the noise echoing in the empty store. Evan, still lingering near the door, glanced around nervously. "Maybe we should just shut up, Evan," Lucas snapped, cutting him off. He turned back to Richard, his voice low and threatening. "You've got guts, old man, I'll give you that, but guts don't mean a damn thing when you're outnumbered." Richard's hand hovered near the silent alarm beneath the counter. He pressed it, activating a signal to the local police. "You should leave," he said, his voice steady. "Now." Lucas laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You really think you can scare us? We own this block." Richard leaned forward, his calm gaze locking onto Lucas. "Not this block, not this store, not today." The standoff stretched for several long seconds before Lucas's bravado faltered. He motioned to Ray and Evan. "Let's go. We'll be back." As the three men left, the faint sound of sirens grew louder. Richard exhaled slowly, his body still tense. The fight was just beginning. But he was ready. He wasn't just defending a store, he was standing up for an entire community. The tension in the air was palpable as the days passed. Richard knew Lucas and his crew would return. And when they did, it wouldn't just be another round of threats. Men like Lucas didn't take kindly to resistance. Richard prepared for what was coming, balancing his days between running the store and ensuring the safety of his customers. Richard spent late nights fortifying the store. He installed additional locks, reinforced the windows with metal bars, and added a panic button behind the counter connected directly to the police. Every detail was deliberate, every step a reflection of his meticulous training. The community began to take notice. Neighbors stopped by to offer support, their gratitude evident in their words. A few even offered to help with repairs, bringing tools and supplies. "Thank you," Richard said to Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, as they worked together to secure the back door. "This means a lot. It's not just for you." Jenkins replied, his voice firm. "This store is part of our home. If we let them take it, what's next?" Richard nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who called this neighborhood home. Detective Sarah Monroe visited the store again, this time with updates. She carried a thick file under her arm, her expression more serious than usual. "We've been tracking Lucas's activities," Sarah said, laying the file on the counter. "It's not just you. They've hit 3 other businesses in the last month. But here's where it gets interesting." She opened the file to reveal a series of documents and photographs. These properties all have one thing in common. They're in areas being targeted by a developer named Victor Harrington. Richard's eyes narrowed as he studied the documents. The name wasn't familiar, but the implications were clear. "What does Harrington want with this neighborhood?" "Profit," Sarah replied. "He's got plans for high-end developments, luxury condos, boutique shops. He's using Lucas and his crew to scare people into selling at rock-bottom prices." Richard's jaw tightened. "So this isn't just about me. It's a coordinated effort." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. Harrington's smart, though. He's insulated himself. Lucas and his men are just pawns. If we want to stop him, we need hard evidence." Richard thought for a moment, then spoke with quiet determination. "Then we'll get it." The more Richard learned about Harrington's schemes, the more determined he became. He wasn't content to simply defend his store, he wanted to expose the corruption at its core. Using his military training, Richard began discreetly surveilling Lucas and his crew. He parked a few blocks away from their known hangouts, using a pair of binoculars to observe their movements. He noted times, locations, and the people they interacted with. Late one night, he saw Lucas meeting with a sharply dressed man outside a black SUV. The man handed Lucas an envelope, which Lucas tucked into his jacket before driving off. Richard snapped a photo with his phone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as Richard reviewed his notes, His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her voice urgent. At the station, Sarah showed him a recording obtained from a nearby business's security camera. The footage showed Lucas and his crew vandalizing a store, followed by a man in a suit entering the premises the next day. It was Harrington himself, speaking to the store owner and presenting what looked like a contract. "That's our link," Sarah said. "If we can tie Harrington directly to Lucas, we've got him." Richard studied the footage carefully. "Then we need more. Something irrefutable." Sarah's investigation uncovered another lead. A meeting scheduled at an abandoned factory on the edge of town. Lucas's crew would be there, along with one of Harrington's fixers. It was a chance to gather crucial evidence. But it was also risky. "I'm going," Richard said when Sarah told him about the meeting. "It's too dangerous," Sarah argued. "Let us handle it." Richard shook his head. "I have the training, and I know what to look for. I can get closer than your team without raising suspicion." Sarah hesitated but eventually relented. "Fine, but we'll be nearby the moment things go south. You get out. Understood?" "Understood," Richard replied, though he knew he wouldn't leave until he had what he needed. The factory was as desolate as it was foreboding, its rusted walls and broken windows standing as a testament to years of neglect. Richard arrived early, parking a safe distance away and approaching on foot. He moved silently through the shadows, his senses sharp as he scoped out the area. Inside, the meeting was already underway. Richard crept closer, staying hidden behind a stack of crates. He recognized Lucas, Ray, and Evan standing near a table covered in papers and cash. A man in a tailored suit, Harrington's fixer, was speaking in low tones, gesturing to a set of blueprints spread across the table. Richard pulled out his phone and began recording. The conversation confirmed everything: Harrington's involvement, the plan to intimidate property owners, and the specific targeting of the community center. But as Richard leaned in for a better view, his foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the ground. "What was that?" one of the men said, spinning toward the sound. Richard froze, his heart pounding. He'd been careful, but now the stakes had just risen. He needed to think fast. The clang of metal on concrete echoed through the factory, and Richard's pulse quickened. He pressed himself against the crates, trying to make his profile as small as possible. The footsteps of Lucas's crew drew closer, their voices filled with suspicion. "Probably just a rat," one of them muttered. "Or something worse," Lucas said sharply. "Check it out. We can't afford any surprises." Richard knew he couldn't afford to be discovered. He glanced at the scattered tools and debris around him, then picked up a rusted bolt. Carefully, he tossed it toward the opposite end of the factory. The clatter drew their attention immediately. "There," one of the men barked, moving toward the noise. As they followed the false trail, Richard exhaled quietly, grateful for the diversion. He turned his attention back to the table, where Harrington's fixer was rolling up the blueprints. It was now or never. Richard adjusted his phone's angle, capturing the blueprints and the fixer's instructions to Lucas. "Take these and make it clear," the fixer said, his voice cold. "We need them out by the end of the week. No more delays. If they don't budge, escalate." Lucas nodded, his expression grim. "What about the community center?" The fixer smirked. "It'll burn. Accidents happen all the time in places like this." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. That was it. The explicit orders, the blueprints, the plans, it was all there. He snapped a few photos of the table for good measure and began retreating, staying low. Just as he neared the exit, one of the men spotted movement out of the corner of his eye. "Hey," he shouted. "Someone's here." Chaos erupted. Lucas barked orders, and the crew scattered, searching for Richard. He sprinted toward the back entrance, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. Adrenaline surged through his veins as shouts and heavy boots followed him. Reaching the rusted door, Richard shoved it open and dashed into the night. The crew's voices grew fainter, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. He ducked into an alley, pressing his back against the wall to catch his breath. From his pocket, he pulled out his phone and checked the footage. It was all there: the orders, the plans, the damning evidence that would tie Harrington directly to the scheme. Now, he just needed to get it to Detective Monroe. Back at the station, Richard handed over the footage to Monroe, her expression shifting from disbelief to determination as she watched the recording. "This is it," she said. "This is what we needed." Harrington can't talk his way out of this. She immediately began organizing a raid on Harrington's offices, coordinating with the district attorney to ensure airtight warrants. The next morning, a convoy of police vehicles descended on Harrington's sleek corporate office. The sharp contrast between the polished glass facade and the corruption hidden within was not lost on Richard as he stood nearby. Watching the operation unfold, detectives stormed the building, seizing documents and arresting key associates. Harrington himself was found in his office, his calm demeanor cracking as he was handcuffed. "This is a mistake," Harrington snarled. "You won't get anything to stick." "We'll see about that," Monroe replied, holding up a copy of the evidence Richard had provided. "Your fixer wasn't as discreet as you thought." As Harrington was led out of the building, he locked eyes with Richard, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "You think you've won?" Harrington hissed. "This isn't over." Richard didn't flinch. "For you, it is." The courtroom was packed as Harrington's trial began. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, the footage from the factory, testimonies from Waller and other arrested associates, and records of fraudulent transactions. Richard took the stand, recounting the harassment and violence he endured. The jury listened intently as Richard spoke about the community center and the families who relied on it. His words painted a vivid picture of the lives disrupted by Harrington's greed. Harrington didn't just target businesses, Richard said, his voice steady but impassioned. He targeted communities he saw as obstacles to be removed, not people. That ends here. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Harrington was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His empire dismantled, his properties were seized, and restitution funds were established to help rebuild the community. For Lucas and his crew, their sentences were similarly harsh. Gary, as the leader, received 15 years. His accomplices faced lesser but still significant sentences. With Harrington behind bars, the neighborhood began to heal. Richard's store became a beacon of resilience, its once broken windows now gleaming with hope. Neighbors rallied around the community center, revitalizing it as a hub of activity and support. Detective Monroe stopped by the store one evening, her expression lighter than Richard had ever seen. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Richard corrected. "This was a fight for all of us." As the sun set over the neighborhood, Richard stood outside his store, watching families stroll by and children play on the sidewalks. The fight had been long and brutal, but the community was stronger for it. For the first time in years, Richard felt at peace, knowing they had reclaimed what was. Months after the trial, the neighborhood was alive with a renewed sense of purpose. Richard's store, once a target of violence and greed, now symbolized the resilience of the community. Its shelves were stocked, the floors polished, and the walls adorned with art created by local youth as part of a community project. The community center, saved from Harrington's destructive plans, had undergone a transformation. Donations and restitution funds allowed for repairs and upgrades, creating a safe and welcoming space for all. The sounds of children laughing, basketballs bouncing, and music classes resonated through its halls. Richard often volunteered his time there, teaching self-defense classes. The sessions were as much about empowerment as they were about physical skills. He wanted to ensure no one else in the community would feel as helpless as he had during those dark days. One afternoon, Maria, the director of the community center, approached Richard after a class. Her eyes sparkled with gratitude. "We wouldn't be here without you," she said. "You gave us the courage to fight back." Richard smiled. "We all fought back. I just happened to be the loudest." Detective Monroe stopped by the store one evening, a folder tucked under her arm. She leaned on the counter, her usual professional demeanor softened by a rare smile. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said, handing Richard the folder. Inside were reports documenting the successful dismantling of Harrington's remaining assets and the allocation of restitution funds to other neighborhoods affected by his schemes. "It's over," Monroe said. "For real this time." Richard closed the folder and placed it on the counter. "Good," he said, "but there's still more to do. This neighborhood needs more than justice. It needs opportunities." Monroe nodded. "And I have a feeling you'll be at the center of that." Word of the neighborhood's triumph spread beyond its borders. Other communities inspired by their fight began to organize, challenging exploitative practices and demanding accountability. Richard became a reluctant figurehead for the movement, sharing his story at events and helping others navigate the challenges of standing up to systemic injustice. Local businesses banded together, forming a coalition to support one another and ensure no one stood alone in the face of future threats. Richard's store became the unofficial headquarters, its back room a meeting place where plans were made and dreams were rebuilt. One quiet evening, Richard sat on the steps of his store, watching the neighborhood come alive under the warm glow of streetlights. Families strolled hand in hand. Teenagers laughed as they shared snacks from the corner shop, and the community center buzzed with activity. Maria joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "After everything that happened?" Richard shook his head. "This is home," he said simply. "It's not perfect, but it's ours, and I'm not going anywhere." The neighborhood still faced challenges, but there was a newfound sense of hope and solidarity. The scars left by Harrington's schemes would take time to heal, but the community was stronger, more united than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in a golden glow, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been worth it. They had reclaimed their home, their dignity, and their future. And for Richard, that was only the beginning. Months turned into years, and the once struggling neighborhood began to thrive. With Harrington's shadow gone, local businesses flourished, and new ventures sprang up, supported by the sense of unity forged during the battle. Richard's store, now a cornerstone of the community, became more than just a place to buy goods. It was a gathering point, a hub of support and connection. With the help of restitution funds and the community's support, Richard expanded the store. He added a small cafe section where neighbors could gather, drink coffee, and catch up. He hired local youth to help run the store, offering them not just jobs but mentorship and guidance. One of his employees, a bright teenager named Darnell, showed a knack for business. Richard took him under his wing, teaching him about inventory, customer service, and financial planning. "You're going to do great things, Darnell," Richard said one day. "You're not just working here. You're building a foundation for your future." Inspired by Richard's bravery, the neighborhood created a community watch program. Residents took turns patrolling the streets, ensuring safety and keeping an eye out for anyone trying to exploit their home again. Maria played a key role in organizing the effort, using her connections with the police department to provide training and resources. The program's success was evident in the drop in crime rates and the increase in community engagement. People who once felt powerless now took pride in protecting what they had built. Maria Monroe, whose determination had been instrumental in taking down Harrington, received a promotion to captain. She remained deeply connected to the neighborhood, using her position to advocate for policies that supported small businesses and protected vulnerable communities. One evening, she stopped by Richard's store, still in uniform, with a proud smile on her face. "Guess what?" she said, handing him a flyer. It was an announcement for a new grant program aimed at supporting minority-owned businesses. "You did this," she said. "Your fight made people pay attention." Richard took the flyer, his expression softening. "We all did this," he said, "but thank you for never giving up on us." The community center continued to expand its programs. In addition to its arts, sports, and education offerings, it opened a small business incubator, helping local entrepreneurs get their ideas off the ground. Richard was often invited to speak at events, sharing his journey and encouraging others to pursue their dreams. One day, Maria, the center's director, approached him with an idea. "We want to start a scholarship fund," she said, "for kids in the neighborhood who want to go to college but can't afford it. Would you help us?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Count me in," he said. As the years passed, Richard became a beloved figure in the neighborhood. His store was a beacon of hope, his actions a reminder of what courage and unity could achieve. People often stopped by just to chat, share their stories, or thank him for what he had done. One afternoon, Darnell approached Richard with an idea. "I want to open my own store," he said, "but I'd like to partner with you." Richard's face lit up with pride. "You've got my full support," he said. "Let's make it happen." Together, they opened a second store in a neighboring community, bringing the same values of integrity, resilience, and service to a new group of people. Richard often reflected on how far they had come. He knew the fight wasn't over, there would always be challenges. People like Harrington who sought to exploit others, But he also knew they had built something strong. Something that would endure. As he stood outside his store one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The lights in the community center glowed warmly. Laughter spilled from the cafe. And families walked the streets with a sense of safety and pride. This was their home, and they had fought for it together. As the years went on, the neighborhood's transformation became a beacon of hope for surrounding areas. News outlets wrote stories about how a once-forgotten corner of the city had risen from adversity through resilience and community effort. Richard often found himself featured in these stories, though he humbly deflected credit to everyone who had stood with him. One spring, the neighborhood organized its first annual Unity Festival, held in the park adjacent to the community center. It was a celebration of their shared achievements. Vendors set up booths selling crafts, food, and art, while local performers showcased their talents on a makeshift stage. Richard was asked to give the opening speech. Standing before the crowd, he looked out at the faces of people who had become his family. Maria was there, smiling proudly. Darnell stood off to the side, already brainstorming ideas for next year's festival. This is what community looks like. Richard began, his voice steady but full of emotion. It's not just about buildings or businesses, it's about people. People who stand together, fight together, and dream together. We've been through a lot, but we're still here. And together, we'll keep building something worth fighting for. The crowd erupted into applause. And as Richard stepped down, Maria approached him. That was beautiful, she said. You've inspired so many people. Just doing my part. Richard replied with a grin. Like we all are. As the community continued to flourish, larger opportunities began to emerge. A nonprofit organization approached the neighborhood about creating a vocational training center. Richard, Maria, and other leaders worked together to secure funding and space for the project. The center offered courses in trades like carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work, skills that could provide stable careers for residents. It also provided mentorship programs, pairing younger participants with seasoned professionals. Richard frequently visited the center, sharing his own experiences as a business owner and encouraging others to pursue their goals. You don't have to wait for someone to give you a chance, he often said. Sometimes, you've got to make your own. Darnell's partnership with Richard turned into a thriving venture. The second store they opened became a hub in its own right, attracting a loyal customer base. Darnell, now in his mid-20s, had grown into a confident and savvy businessman. One evening, as they closed up shop together, Darnell turned to Richard. You know, he said, none of this would have happened without you. Richard chuckled. Don't sell yourself short, kid. You've worked hard for this. Still, Darnell said, his tone serious. You showed me what's possible. I want to do the same for others. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. Then you're doing exactly what you should. Maria's role as a police captain allowed her to effect systemic changes within the department. She implemented community policing initiatives, ensuring that officers were more involved in the neighborhoods they served. She also pushed for diversity and inclusion training, making sure that her team understood the communities they protected. Under her leadership, trust between law enforcement and the neighborhood grew stronger. Maria often hosted town halls at the community center, inviting residents to voice their concerns and ideas. You've done so much, Richard said after one of these meetings. We're lucky to have you. Maria shook her head. No, we're lucky to have each other. None of this works without people like you standing up and showing what's possible. The neighborhood's success inspired younger generations to dream big. Children who had once seen hardship as inevitable now saw hope and opportunity. The scholarship fund that Richard helped establish grew each year, supporting students in pursuing higher education. One of those students, a bright young woman named Tasha, returned after graduating from college with a degree in urban planning. She approached Richard with a proposal to create more green spaces and public art installations in the neighborhood. I want to give back, Tasha said. You've all given me so much. Richard smiled. Let's get to work. As Richard grew older, he began to think about his legacy. He wasn't worried about the store or the buildings, they were just structures. What mattered to him was the spirit of the neighborhood, the sense of unity and determination that had carried them through their darkest days. One evening, as he locked up the store, he noticed a mural painted on the side of the community center. It depicted scenes from the neighborhood's history, families rebuilding homes, children playing in the streets, and Richard standing proudly behind his counter. At the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Together, we rise." Richard stood there for a long moment, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The mural wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had fought for this place and made it better. As he turned to head home, he knew one thing for certain: the neighborhood was in good hands. The seeds they had planted together would continue to grow, and the future was brighter than ever.